Well, thank you, Silke, and thanks for everybody for coming. And sorry for this late notice of having another talk today. This is going to be a little bit of kind of, I'm a bit too ambitious. I might actually not get to the end. So I'm going to try to tell two stories that are sort of related in a sense that they are deal with the what I'm interested in, which is trying to understand how the effects of activity affect collective motion of cells. So something which is happening at the scales of a tissue, right? So a lot of this is done with Silke, although the core part of the chick embryo, Silke is going to tell us this when she gives the talk. So I'm going to show you chick embryo, but I'm not going to talk much about this. I collaborate with a person whose name is even harder to pronounce than mine, Andrei Kushman, in Princeton, and a lot of work in here is done with Julia Yeomans and Jan Rosman, who is a postdoc with Julia, and the second part is heavily influenced by work of Daniel Matos Fernandez, who is a collaborator of mine now at Madrid, and he was a postdoc in Dundee. Okay, so what you're seeing in here is first 30 hours of life of a chicken, right? So this is live imaging of a chicken embryo done by my colleague, Kay Sweyer in Dundee. So this is roughly 4 millimeters across. The embryo at this stage is almost completely flat. Starts with, let's say, 150,000 cells, goes up to, let's say, 250,000 cells, 300, that order of magnitude, towards the end of this movie. The image is done using light sheet microscopy. So this is transgenic embryo. So the proteins that are sitting on the membrane of the cell membranes are being labeled with the GFP, and then you shine laser on them, they shine back, and then you run this through a sheet of light, and you can, after a lot of image processing, you reconstruct an image that looks like this. Please ignore the squares. Squares are there because there is a second part of this in movie which is not important in here. So what you're seeing in here is, let me go back. So this is the posterior of the embryo. This is the anterior of the embryo. So the head, tail, and you're going to see there flows, morphogenic flows of cells that are going to result in a bright elongated region in here, which is what's called the primitive streak. So that's the gastrulation in chicken. That's the beginning of all of us. That's what breaks the symmetry and creates. It's going to create a neural channel and eventually develop into a brain and spine and so on and so on. So this is how this looks like. Again, so there are large flows. Unfortunately, this is not very nice to see on Zoom. I think the Zoom is glitchy. But those of you who are in here in 2 weeks' time at the workshop, Case is going to show these movies in more details, right? And this is the primitive streak. There's going to be a head, and then the somites are going to be forming in here, and the spine is going to develop, right? So this is roughly 30 hours after development, where this all stops, and these spots in here, this is just the embryo that goes out of box, right? That's what it looks like. So this is a living organism. This in here is something which physics community still like to call tissues, but these are actually cell monolayers. So these are now rather old experiments when Chavi Trepal was postdoc in Jack Roberts' lab in Harvard. So these are NBC cells. So these are cells that are derived from a kidney of a dog, and they were immortalized, and they're put on some kind of a substrate. And when they are let go, they move, and they form very interesting stress patterns, which Chavi measured and identified using traction force microscopy. However, these two systems are fundamentally different from each other. This one has a substrate, right? So cells are crawling on a substrate. This one doesn't have a substrate. So this is a free-floating sheet, right? Which is actually attached at the edges to what is called the epithelial membrane, but the core of the embryo does not have any support. Right? Yep.
What is it that induces the movement at lower figure?
Lower figure. In here, well, I mean, these are exactly so there is a lengthy discussion about whether they are kind of living cells and later cells that are pushing it, or some kind of tug of war type of mechanism and so on and so on. In here is much more complicated. I mean, that's what we are trying to understand. What is actually inducing in here, right? Because in here you don't have to push against anything, you only can pull against each other.
And these embryos, which it has no support.
Yep.
But it's inside the egg, right? So
Yes.
it's over in some fluid.
Well, so yeah, so there is, so this is sitting on the top of the yolk, so yolk is
Okay,
below.
okay, so
and then-
they have a substrate which is the yolk.
Yeah, but it's not really substrate, meaning it's and actually in between the yolk and the embryo there is more goo, meaning it's complicated what's going on inside.
Okay.
But it's a liquid, right? So there is nothing you
It's a
can,
liquid, okay.
yeah, you cannot really. So actually embryo is, I mean, it's an interesting story. Embryo starts building the substrate as it goes, right? So this is what's called epiblast, and underneath you have a hypoblast which is being built. But this early on you don't really have it. Okay, so how do we model things like this? Well, the standard go-to model that I like to use is the vertex model, right? So this is a very kind of physicsy, cartoonish way of representing epithelial cells. In this particular case, these are columnar epithelia. So you can think of it as small prisms. And then if you look at the top, there is something called tight junctions. That's essentially what prevents epithelia from leaking fluid, right? So if you look from the top, so this is the image that was taken by Eva Maria Scholz when she was a postdoc on 10 years ago or so, right? This is on a zebrafish. So if you look on this from the top, it looks like a tiling in your bathroom. Well, the esoteric bathroom, right? So this looks like a polygonal tiling. So of course you can actually abstract the entire thing as a kind of polygonal tiling of a plane where your cells are polygons, 2 cells share an edge, and 3 or more edges meet at the vertex, and the vertex is the degree of freedom. And then you can assign area, perimeter, native area, and stiffnesses and lengths, and you can write an energy functional that looks something like this. And I'll tell you in a second what these terms are. But the major assumption in here is that this is a single line. In actual cells, you have a membrane on cell A and membrane on cell B, and they talk to each other, right? So assumption in here is that this is all merged into a single line. Right? Okay. So there are 2 terms. The first term is essentially the penalty of changing the area of the cell, and it actually has to do with the fact that cell more or less conserves its volume. So if you try to change the height of the cell, you're going to change the projected area. So there is some kind of a penalty of changing the area. There is a penalty of changing perimeter because there is this cortex up here which is trying to contract the entire cell, and then there is a line tension between neighboring cells, which can be either positive or negative. And in the next slide, I'm going to combine these 2 terms in a convenient way for further analysis, right? And I need to mention a little bit of history. The model was was first introduced in the early 80s by Yugichi and Honda, and sort of safely forgotten until it was rediscovered in 2000s, right? So, and ever since it's been actually quite a bit used. Okay, so what is interesting about this model? I can actually now rewrite it in this form by combining the terms on the previous slide. So I can write in this rather symmetric form where I have a penalty of changing the area of a cell, and I have a penalty of changing the perimeter of a cell with some kind of couple constants, and I can define this dimensionless ratio of a preferred perimeter of the cell with the square root of the preferred area, and that ratio is going to become very interesting, as pointed out by Max B when he was a postdoc in Lisa Manning's group in Syracuse. That if you tune this parameter to a point which was then claimed 3.81, nowadays we know that this is actually a range of values, so somewhere around 3.8 or so, the system undergoes a solid to liquid phase transition, right? So below P naught of 3.81, the system is solid, and above the system is liquid. And in here, what I mean by solid and liquid, it means that there is an energy barrier to changing cell neighbors. That's what I mean. So how you can see this is by adding some kind of activity to the cell, and this is taken from one of Max's talks, right? So for low values of P naught, so you give them some self-propulsion, they just jiggle in space, right? And you can do this during the MSD calculation. And for high values of P naught, cells move. And the movement of cells occurs through neighbor exchange to what is called a P1 transition. So the cells essentially change neighbors. So that's the, yep.
And this doesn't depend on K and gamma?
No, it doesn't. No, it does not. It only depends on P naught. Right? It actually depends on the specifically on the type of tiling, right? So the statement in here, there are two numbers because the original statement was the 3.72 for hexagonal tiling, 3.81 for random tiling, but now we know that not all random tilings are the same, and we don't really fully understand it why, but the range is between some 3.8 and 3.9. That's roughly.
Sorry, I'm not sure to what extent everything is known here or not, but I mean, if it's reversible, it's going to go from right to left and left to right, and how can it depend on the solid thing?
So I mean, so again, I'm not, so Max is to talk about it. I'm not with but I think if you pick a tiling, right, then you can go back and forth for a given value of P naught.
Once I go into the fluid, I should be fluid, right?
Yes, you're full, yeah, but then if you want to, yeah, are you want to resolve it? That's a good question. That's a good question. Yeah, but Jen has a
I
comment.
think yeah, Jorge and I are on this paper as well, and the understanding here's where our contribution was in terms of the 3.81, something is actually located where the pentagon occurs.
Yeah.
So the pentagon would be the unit area. That would be the P naught for that case. And so the topology is what matters. And why? Because the pentagon is where this T1 happens. And so if there is a zero energy barrier, at least for these two cells that are preventing these two cells from coming in contact, if their energy vanishes, then you can have cells changing neighbors. So it's a topological argument, if you will. It doesn't depend on the ratio of K to gamma. Yeah.
But
sorry.
yeah,
So this assumes all cells are same area.
That
Yeah,
the
yeah,
argument
yeah,
I just
yeah,
mentioned exactly the
yeah.
calculation we did was initially for unit area for all cells. That's correct. And if you relax that condition by having like a soft spring area spring, so instead of having a delta function where each is constrained to be not, you relax that, then you can have sort of maybe some slightly different width of the 3.81.
I mean, just like you follow up, you're just saying this appears to be more complicated than people realized earlier, and asking each of the transition, its location that depends on the ratio of K to gamma, and exactly what that landscape looks like, and exactly what kind of condition it is, probably unclear, but definitely something is happening. Yeah.
But to a first approximation. This was
Zero temperature argument. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yep.
This is only for a surface though, right? Whereas the cells are only 3D.
Yeah, I mean, this is for a two-dimensional model. I mean, if you go to 3D, then yeah. Okay, good. So and then Andrea and I started talking about this, and then we realized that the actually to our great surprise, nobody has actually done the simple linear shear rheology of this model. And we were expecting, because the model has been there for like more than 40 years, that somebody should have looked into this, but nobody has looked into this. So what we did, we essentially tried to do the shear rheology of this model. So we take the vertex model, put it in a box and shear it, and actually our shear is much smaller than what is shown in here. This is grossly exaggerated for visualization purposes, and then we essentially just do the standard rheology experiment where we measure the storage and loss modulus by derived from the complex modulus. And then we did it in the solid and the fluid regime, and then we calculated the storage modulus and the shear modulus. Storage modulus and the loss modulus. And in the solid phase, these curves look like this. We were fitted by what is called the standard linear solid, which is a Maxwell element. So the spring and the dashpot in parallel with the spring. And in the fluid regime, we could model this as two Maxwell models, which give two relaxation timescales, which can be seen here with the two peaks. But that's
Yeah, you have an insight, but any of it corresponds to.
yes, that's the next slide, right? So we did some kind of hand waving arguments in here, and these dashed lines, which are not really very visible in here, this is the fit to the models, to these kind of simple rheological models. And then we start doing some kind of hand waving arguments where these these peaks correspond to. But then we realized why not actually do the oops, this was not supposed to be there, okay? But why not because it's a linear regime, why not do the linear the kind of normal mode analysis, right? So this is rather technical. I'll go quickly through it. So we wanted to be a little bit fancier than the standard linear normal mode analysis. So what we assume that actually we allow for the friction to not to be local, but we allow the friction to kind of to relative motion of the vertices, which is so. For example, if you have a friction which just comes from the relative velocity of the vertices, not just from the vertex against the substrate, and then can be encoded in some kind of a symmetric matrix C. So you have a equation of motion. This looks like this. So you have some kind of a matrix times the velocity is equal minus gradient of your forces, and this looks sunny, right? Okay, and then but what you can do is you can then do a standard normal mode analysis, which I can tell everything about. So you essentially find the equilibrium configuration, you perturb it a little bit, right? And then you linearize your equations, you end up with a Hessian, which is around 400 lines of Python code to implement, and 2 people putting their hair for several weeks to find all the bugs. But it's completely straightforward, right? And then you end up with a generalized eigenvalue problem. It's a generalized eigenvalue problem because you have this C matrix in there, right? And then from then on, it's completely straightforward. Then you write your displacement as linear combination of your normal modes, right? And then you have the equation for these amplitudes, but they are not decoupled, right? And then each of these lambdas is going to be the corresponding frequency of that given moment. This is completely undergraduate physics, nothing deep. And then you just cleverly express stress in terms of the linear combination of normal modes, right? And then you're set and done. You have a showcase of knowing how to type in LaTeX, right? Yep.
And you said relaxation concept the mode that includes the participation fields now with reference to mode, or like
Well, there is no mixing of modes. Right? This is all.
Are you talking the modes of the combined thing, or
No, I'm just talking about the you just diagonalize it back. That's all. Right? So linear. No combination, no scattering of nothing, right? No scattering of modes.
It's sort of a generalized, generalized.
Well, generalized because of this C matrix in here, right? Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Under what assumptions do you get this equation of motion? Is it that kind of all of the friction is in the vertex?
Well, yeah. So all the friction is always in the vertex because that's a degree of freedom, right? And then you do kind of, so we have a model where we do just the friction on the vertex, which is just diagonal matrix, right? You can have a relative motion of vertices, you can have a relative motion of the cell centers, but then you just rewrite it in terms of then you cook it up to be written in terms of vertices, right? Yeah. And so linear logic, right? Yeah. So we can talk about this later because there's some technicalities of that you need to normalize. You need to put something in the diagonal. You have to have a little bit of on-site friction, otherwise everything blows and so on. So, yeah. And then essentially what you can do is you can write the expressions for the storage modulus and the loss modulus in terms of these normal modes, and then you can have an expansion which looks like this, right? So this is the general expansion of all the. So each of these modes contributes an element like this, right? But this is rather generic. This can apply for any sort system. It doesn't have to be the vertex model. It can be any system, right? And then you can now see that the peaks. This is now for hexagonal one. So the dots are simulations, which were done in the first project, and the lines are curves, theory curves without fitting parameters, right? So this is it's all linear. It's not really surprising. And then you see that peaks essentially correspond to modes that have a high contribution. So essentially these are the peaks in the response correspond to the dominating modes. Right? So now how these modes look like in a hexagonal lattice, this is for example one of the dominating modes. Right? For a random tiling with some kind of mass which I stared at and it's nothing obvious pops out. Right? Why it looks the way it looks like. Right? And then this in the liquid state, you essentially have two regions, right? So two regions where modes are have a significant contribution, right, and they exactly correspond to these two peaks. And that's essentially the exponential two time scales. Beyond that, it's very hard to.
I still like the chart because I'm giving you 15 years of trial and error.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is we were. I was up to the point where we submitted. I was surprised that this was not really. We were digging through the literature quite a bit, right? Because I was expecting to find this somewhere, right? Okay, good. But that's and that's essentially just now we get back to the issue of activity, right? So this was a main side comment about the linear rheology, right? And then there is actually not very interesting nonlinear rheology part of this, which Max B is probably going to talk about when he comes in next week, right? Where you essentially, if you shear this more than 10⁻⁷ as we did, and then you allow T1 transitions and what happens inside. That's actually becoming very, very interesting story. We didn't touch this at all. But let's actually get back to the story of activity in the systems, especially in the confluent epithelia. So by confluent, I mean epithelia, there are no holes, right? So where cells touch each other, right? Since cells are closely packed to each other, and they cannot allow holes. And if you want to move in such a very crowded environment, you cannot do this by brute force, right? You have to do it cleverly. And the ways how cells exchange, how essentially activity enters into the problem is either through cell rearrangement, so-called intercalation events, where cells exchange neighbors, right? So essentially, you want to leave a very crowded room. Unless you're very big, you're probably just going to be tapping people on the shoulder and swapping places with them, right? Cells also can ingress in the case of embryos or extrude if cells die. For embryos, they rarely die. For mature tissues, they do, right? So they get removed by an extrusion event, right? And also cells can divide, right? In a chick embryo, this is roughly every 6 hours or so. So these are all kind of cell level, if you will, microscopic, quote unquote, effects that actually can lead to the activity, right? But now the question is, what is more microscopic phenomenon which leads to actual activity, right? So these are phenomenological statements that we observe, but what leads to these things, right? So because the cell itself is an active, complicated machine, so it does something in order to be able to do these things. And I think this is one of the open questions which the community is trying to answer, the part of the time to us. So when I started collaborating with Julia Yeomans, as we've seen yesterday or no 2 days ago in Chu Fan's talk, there was quite a bit of discussion of this SAW experiment. This is again experiment on MDCK cells, where they are related extrusion events to the presence of the topological defects in the nematic order. And in here, nematic order is a readout of a cell shape. So they took images of these monolayers, calculated the average cell shape, found the nematic, and then identified the positions of topological defects. And then they claim that the position of this topological defect is correlated with the points where that cell is extruded. So there is some kind of a biological function to the presence of a topological defect. And the similar kind of nematic patterns have been seen in myoblasts, for example, also in MDCK cells, and so on and so on. So we set out to kind of go then one level deeper than kind of this phenomenological discussion of cells, intercalation, extrusion, and division, and try to see what kind of the microscopic now one level lower mechanism could lead to some of these phenomena. Right? And of course, everything is inspired by the story about active turbulence, right? So this has nothing to do with cells. This is microtubules extracted and put in a suspension, and then kinesin motors were added, and this is what happens. So this was done in Zvonimir Djogic's lab, who is known as Djogich for some reason. And then this is simulation of Luca Giomi of 10 or so years ago, where the same phenomenon is seen. So this is a nematic, and if you add an active term to this, you get what's called active turbulence, which means that these topological defects are spontaneously created and annihilated, right? And we're not going to go into this. Everybody knows much more about this than I do. Okay, good. So what we decided to do is, I'm going to skip this because everybody knows what pneumatics are. So what we decided to do, we decided to see if we can actually add some kind of pneumatic-like response to the vertex model. So we start with the vertex model, write it in this form of the symmetric form, right? Then we non-dimensionalize it, right? And then what we say, and this is we essentially this is us cooking this up, right? So we take some kind of readout of the cell shape. In this particular case, we've used moment of inertia, where we put unit masses of each of the vertices, and then calculate its principal axis, and the eigenvector corresponding to the larger of the two corresponds to our pneumatic director. There's other ways to do this, and then we say, like, well, if the junction is sort of aligned with the direction, it's going to have a higher tension, and if it is perpendicular to it, it's going to have a lower tension. So it's a kind of mechanism that couples shape to tension, right? Again, we invented this, meaning there is no biological, it's not like that there is a biological experiment on a particular site of cell that actually does this, right? And then you can essentially write an active force term, which looks something like this, where you have an active tension, which now depends on the angle between the director and the junction. And then you ask, and then you're always going to use zeta less than one. I think this, I don't think that everybody agrees on this convention. Julian uses this convention for contractile.
Yeah, noise in there.
Yeah.
It's a noise in there.
There can be noise in here, but we didn't, doesn't really change anything from what we did.
Sorry, when you compute the direction of the director.
Yep.
Do you take any notice of how big is it? How far from circular?
No,
It's unit linearly.
yeah, and that's an example. So there is no meaning. So this is really, it's really just direction, right? So just cosine, right? Cosine kind of nothing, right? That's a really good point, right? Because what you can do is, because if you do hexagonal cell, then all bets are off, right? And you can very easily, if you're close to hexagon, right? So you're going to point this way, and then you slightly change to this direction, and you have a jump, right? So this should be encoded somehow.
Oh, the trend is how you actually the gradient of the L.
Yes, so Jan wrote it that way, postdoc wrote it that way to look like the kind of what we normally see in the one, right? But the idea is, as I said, tension is higher if you are aligned to the direction, whatever direction it is. Okay, good. Okay, and this is what we do. So we have this is deep in the solid phase, whatever solid phase in this context means, because we have this additional activity term for relatively low activity, and then for moderate activity. So, and then these cells that are in color, so they are essentially, there is no meaning to them. It's just to see that they're moving. So these are just labels for us to see them moving, right? And then in a fluid phase with high activity, and I'm going to stop this movie because I want to point something to you, which is what surprised us. And these are distance, right? And you also see them in here. So these things. So kind of circular type of it, yep.
What's your Q1?
Doesn't matter in here. So we've done several, right? So in this case, this is what the Slovenian group does, which Matej Krajnc and Primož Herald, right? So if the junction is shorter than a certain length, you flip it, and you flip it in the random direction, and you make it slightly longer, and then you prevent it from flipping for like next 2 or 3 steps. I do the Spencer algorithm, which is essentially you collapse it into a 4 vertex and then do the decision based on forces. they have one implemented with stresses, so all of them qualitatively get the same result. Doesn't really, yeah. But what is interesting here, you see the circles, right? And then if you look closer into this, into these circles, right? This is one which is extracted in here, right? This is actually a +1 topological defect. Right? So we've seen a +1 topological defect in something which is a pneumatic, but in here I'm going to put quote unquote pneumatic because pneumatic in here is a readout of a shape. It's not that you have rod-like objects that are doing something. And these things are very stable, right? Meaning eventually they will fall apart and everything gets into a boring kind of death of the universe kind of ordered pneumatic state. But what stabilizes them is that actually vertex model creates a ring of high tension. So you have like a rubber band. You put like a rubber band around your +1 defect, and then this seems to stabilize the defect. Eventually they die out because again topological constraints require you to have the same number of, meaning it has to be a 0 topological charge, and then eventually some -1/2 comes in and makes a mess. Right? -1/2s are extremely rare because you cannot make a simple construction with the loops around them, right? Because they look like inflow and outflow, right? But these guys seem to be living for sometimes even as long as a simulation. The simulations very often goes to something like 100 million time steps, right? So these things seem to be quite stable. Right? So we are essentially now trying to understand: can we come up with some kind of simple analytical understanding of why this is the case? Go ahead.
I'm curious about your argument. Why are the minus defects rare?
Sorry, what did mine?
Why you said the minus defects are rare?
-1. -1,
Okay.
yeah, because -1, how much -1 looks like something like this, like 2 in and 2 out, right?
Yeah.
And you cannot really construct the tension ring around them, which would stabilize them. Right?
With regards to boundary conditions, these are
Periodic, yeah.
Have you checked if you make the feedback not absolute, but proportional to the equivalent of cell of change of anything?
We should do that. No, we have not.
You might get disordered regions or there's not enough.
Yeah. Well, yes, meaning yes, yeah. So because so there are all these things like the T1, all of them kind of have some, but this seems to be quite robust, right? And I think this is just essentially just telling us that the pneumatic in here, and this is just my opinion, not everybody agrees with me, is that pneumatic is in here just a readout of the shape, right? That this model wants to do whatever it wants to do, right? And then just this pneumatic thing is the readout. Okay, but then I think Farzan can tell us much more about this, right? The kind of like, so there are these very interesting ideas that actually, for example, in Hydra, people see +1 topological defects, which are some people believe associated with where is budding, right? And then Jan Rosman did some interesting work in his PhD with Primož Zichar on organoids, where they essentially saw the correlation between the presence of topological defects and budding, right? But I'm going to leave it to that. I'm not gonna discuss. And now any questions about any of this? Because I'm gonna completely change the app.
Yeah, so you can also this effective extensile behavior.
Yeah.
You have this class upper member which move in the direction of positive contractile.
So the question, have we seen actually the hallmark of actual active turbulence in this thing? No, we have not. Right? Meaning we have not seen the standard active turbulence, meaning of kind of +1s and -1s creating and then kind of moving in the direction of the comet. And
well, I mean, the system is contractile.
Yeah.
I think in Chupan talk 2 days ago, he was talking about an effective
Extensile
behavior that can emerge from a purely which is which shows this by looking at the motion of the effect. So I just wonder if you see the signature of extensile behavior in the simulation.
No, but we have not looked hard enough. Because I need to check Chupan's work and then we try to see if we can maybe. Well, so essentially, the original idea was to see if we can actually see the active turbulence as normally seen in the movies, and we don't. Right? And again, I again think that this is not really an pneumatic system, right? Okay, good. And I'm completely now changing gears, and I'm gonna talk about how to add elasticity, how to add activity to the elasticity when the curvature is present. So I'm leaving the world of vertex model behind. So this is rendering from Wolfert's book. Wolfert was one of the pioneers of the elemental biology. So this is the, if you're taking elemental biology, you'll be studying it from his book. So this is rendering. This is drawing of the early stage chick embryo. So this is what we've seen in actual images. That's the primitive streak. This is called the Hansen node. That's where the brain is going to be formed. And then what you haven't seen in the movie is essentially the cells that are ingressing towards the primitive streak. They are going down into this mesoderm, and they are going the EMT epithelial to mesenchymal transition, and they slowly differentiate in order to generate the body plan of the chicken, right? And then this is the hypoplast in between. So this is below. This is this bottom membrane which is being built as you go, right? And again, this is the same movie. So the bottom in here is just the analysis of the movie above, which shows you that there is a huge amount of actually deformation of the tissue. So this was created backwards. So they identified the cells that were sitting in the streak, and then they tracked them back and actually showed that there is only one particular region of the cells which is responsible for most of the morphogenic flows in here. And this is what's called the sickle shape, because it is the sickle shape. And the blue are contractions, that are expansions of tissue. So there is a huge deformation of the tissue involved, but there is also substantial deformation of the tissue in the 3 dimensions. So this is a 3D rendering. This took forever to make. This was done in Blender. So this is now a 3D. So this is again live imaging. This is experiment. This is not a simulation. So this is how the gastrulation in chicken looks like, right? So this is the groove. So there is also kind of, this is bumpy, right? Now, I would not give too much into the actual scales, because there's a lot of image analysis, image processing going on, but this is not the flat surface. So this thing is actually going out of plane, right? And I think this is something which really interests me in kind of trying to understand how an active system which can go out of plane can go out of plane. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not going to solve this problem. I would really love to solve this problem, but I'm just going to propose a model which could go in the direction of addressing this problem. Then at the same time, probably everybody's seen these videos before. So this is the biofilm growth. Daniel is a very resourceful man. He's a theorist who actually did some experiment by himself. So this is E. coli forming a biofilm. So over roughly 48 hours, biofilms are very physically interesting objects. They're also, from the medical point of view, incredibly important, because it's very hard to get rid of them. So you want to avoid them being on also kind of medical devices, and you also don't want to have them in your bathroom, your kitchen, and stuff like that, right? So there is a very nice work of Andrei Kushmerl, and I think Howard Stone, and so on on the ENI, where they actually looked into this in more details and proposed a very interesting model of understanding of the biofilms. So why am I talking about the biofilms? Well, they have these interesting angles. Right? Now this object is much bigger. I mean, you can see this with the naked eye. So this is again some kind of out equilibrium system which grows and wrinkles. Right? Now, of course, this is much slower than in the case of the chicken embryo, but we have a system which is out of equilibrium and grows. And then, of course, there are gazillion interesting, beautiful images of these things. Right? So with this kind of radially emitting tentacles. Right? Okay, so, and you've already, well, nobody reads a newspaper anymore, but in the old days before internet, when you were reading newspapers, you probably discovered this by yourself. If you accidentally spill coffee on your newspaper, this is what happens, right? So the thing wrinkles, and the reason it wrinkles is because water gets into the cellulose fibers, they start expanding, but they cannot expand because the surrounding is dry, and they just go out of plane. Maha has some very interesting papers. Mahadeva has some interesting papers on why crisps or chips, as Americans would call them, are crooked. Then you take your potato and you cut them, slice them, and then you put them in the oil, and they never come straight. They always get kind of crooked. It's kind of an interesting story why they are. It also has to do with this thing. Yeah. Okay. So what we set out to do, we set out to essentially make a marriage of thin sheet elasticity and active matter, and add a little bit of viscosity to the story to make things interesting, right? So very briefly, thin sheet mechanics is being worked out by Kirchhoff and Love in early 20th century, and then Koiter did quite a bit of really interesting work in the 50s. All of this is in Landau Lifshitz, and engineers know about this. So thin sheet is an elastic material which is very thin and very large, much thinner compared to these lateral dimensions. So if you look in a cross section, you have a very small thickness, and then along this thickness you can find what is called the neutral surface or neutral surface, which is exactly in the middle. So if you try to bend this, everything which is above the bending line with respect to the direction of the bending is going to be compressed, and everything which is below is going to be stretched, and that actually is what is responsible for the bending deformation, right? So what you can do is you can now parameterize this in what's called Morse parameterization, where your displacement is with respect to the x and y axis, and then you use what is called Kirchhoff-Love assumptions, and that's because it's very thin. You assume that there are no normal stresses along the system, and you also assume that there is no mixing, so that the layers in your sheet are not mixing. And under these conditions, you can derive a set of equations. So you can essentially derive the formula for the elastic energy, right, in terms of the trace of the strain tensor and the square of the trace of the strain tensor, and the strain tensor which looks like this in terms of these deformations, right? And you get an energy functional which looks so, and then then what you do is you essentially integrate around the thickness of your sheet, and you end up with a two-dimensional theory, right? So now you have a theory which is only for a two-dimensional sheet, but you have an additional term which is the bending term, which appears in here, which is thickness to the power of 3, right? So you have the stretching term, so the in-plane deformation of the sheet, which comes with the thickness, and then the bending term, which comes in terms of the thickness to the power of 3, and then you say like, okay, this is perturbative, so I can forget about h to the 3, but that's not really true, because as we know with a sheet of paper, you can actually make quite a bit of bends which don't involve any stretching, so this is cannot really treat this perturbative, because you can make what's called isometric changes of your plates, deformations that do not involve stretching, but actually involve quite a bit of bending, and that's why it becomes nasty. And there is actually a sentence in the 7th book of Landau which says the resulting equations are extremely complicated and rarely possible to solve. Landau writes that. So instead of actually writing these couple for common equations, right, which are complicated nonlinear equation, you can forget about all this mumbo jumbo, right, and essentially treat this as a minimization problem. So you write the elasticity, so you write the stretching and bending terms in terms of these strain tensors, and these are essentially tensors which capture curvature, which tell you what is the bending deformation, right? You discretize this as a mesh, and then you have Daniel, who is a fantastic GPU programmer, who implements this on a GPU, and then you essentially have an energy minimizer, or a quote-unquote molecular dynamics problem, where you treat this as a bunch of points sitting in the corners of a mesh, which are obeying this type of dynamics. Right? And that's exactly what we did. So you essentially discretize your stretching bending energy in terms of triangles, and then you discover that actually computer graphics people work on this quite a bit, because if you want to render complicated shapes, this is what you need to do. And they develop this thing which is called discrete differential geometry, discrete exterior calculus, which allows you to translate all of this stuff in terms of the 0 forms, 1 forms, and 3 and 2 forms that are living on the vertices, edges, and triangles of your mesh. So this becomes a very interesting, mathematically becomes a very interesting theory. And then, so how do you, so what do you essentially, what do we do? So we have a stretching energy and we have a bending energy, and how we implement them as the deformation of a triangle with respect to some kind of reference state, right? Where the G bar corresponds to the reference state of my triangle, these bar quantities, and the blue are the deformed quantities, and then the bending energy is implemented as a behavioral angle between two neighboring triangles. Now, of course, for people who work with this, they know that there are some issues with this formula, but for practical purposes, this works quite well, right? And now you can actually take, you take Mathematica, right? And then you can take the coordinates of all the vertices buried in these letters. You can actually take these derivatives and you can derive the equation of motion. So you can actually calculate the force on the vertex. Is our next expression, but they're all local, right? So they only depend on your connectivity of the network. So you can actually do this incredibly fast, right? And if you figure out, as Daniel did, how to implement a mesh on a GPU, then you this 500 pound. But we also wanted to augment things by introducing the possibility that the system is viscoelastic, right? And how we did this, we essentially assumed that our reference state, which is described by this reference metric G bar, which is nothing but for each triangle a dot product between the edges of a triangle, right? So that's very constructive. It's easy to convince yourself that's it. So we essentially postulated as some kind of a first order dynamics on this reference state. So we are allowing our triangle to chase the deformed state. So this mumbo jumbo in here essentially means that if I deform my triangle and keep it deformed, then my reference rate is going to creep up back to it and say like, okay, I'll give up. I mean, that's what you want me to be deformed. I'm going to be deformed. And what is beauty about all of this for people who work in elasticity, there is absolutely no need to kind of to make any reference to the kind of stress-free reference state and so on. So these questions about whether metric is embeddable and so on. Don't worry about any of this. Right? So essentially, just you do everything with respect to this reference metric state, right? And then you can actually write a dynamical equation for the system, right? Where the dynamics of the vertex is just the gradient of the energy, which in this case depends on the metric, realized metric of the system, reference metric, and the bending. Again, nasty formulas, but just vector products and cross products, nothing dot products and cross products. You can add a little bit of noise, right? And then you can also write a relaxation for the reference state. So you can think of it as a spring, as a native spring of your, or a rest, or a native length of your spring, right? Just written in a two-dimensional case, which is allowed to be curved, right? Where you can, for example, allow it to grow or relax to some kind of reference state. So conceptually, nothing complicated, just a lot of indices and a lot of coding, right? It's nothing deep, right? And then once you have this, you can actually now start analyzing the problem. So you implement this on GPUs, for example, right? And then you have a kind of a vertex, you have a kind of molecular dynamics type of code, or Brownian dynamics type of code for a mesh. In this case, you do not change your triangulation, because then the question of what your reference metric is becomes tricky. But we can talk about this. I mean, it's even this is nasty, right? Okay, good. And then you can now start playing the questions about, so you can have several time scales. So there is a very fast time scale, which is the elastic, the acoustic ones, right? Which you don't care about, which just comes from the Young's modulus, right? Then there is a bending time scale, which goes as 1 over the bending rigidity. There is some kind of a viscous time scale which you put in by hand, right? And there is some kind of active time scale which you also put in by hand, right? And then you can ask a question, is it feasible to have a case, meaning so people have done a lot of work on a very slow growth, right? And that by slow growth, I mean that all the active processes are happening at much slower time scale than the elastic relaxation, right? So your leaves are growing and they're growing very slowly, right? But then, so the system has a time to relax to some kind of a local energy minimum in terms of the energy, elastic energy. But we ask the question: does it even make sense? Maybe you can do it on a computer, but does it make sense to actually have an opposite regime where you are putting the energy in the system so fast that the system does not have time to relax? And that was actually inspired by one of Maha's paper again. We had to look into prebiotic. How they're called, prebiotic organisms. So these organisms that are even predate cells that actually tend to be growing faster than they can relax. With the PRL in 2019 or something like that, right? Yeah, and then we essentially did a simple scaling analysis, which I don't want to bother you with, but we kind of managed to convince ourselves, and this is a lot of campaigning here. That's I don't want to go into details. That under the kind of, if I sprint a little bit, close the door and kind of shut the blinds, it might be that this time scale can be as fast as 10 seconds. So it's plausible that I could have a scenario even in the embryo that essentially the input of the energy is so fast that the embryo does not have time to relax. And then I truly have a non-equilibrium problem in which the system is growing or doing something actively without having time to elastically relax, right? And then I have a different situation from a root growing or from a leaf growing, right? And then we did a bunch of simulations to show that you can get interesting patterns. I'm pointing this out. This was done on a single laptop. This was done on a laptop, right, with 1 million triangles. That's the beauty of